Hi, I'm Khalil Cumberbatch, Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including from those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that it is affected by. We ask you, the viewer, to spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at The Fortune Society. My guest today is Marlon Peterson, writer, host of the Decarcerated podcast, and principal of the Presidential Group. As the conversation unfolds, please let us know your thoughts by tweeting at us at Ka Cumberbatch and at _Marlon Peterson. Today's show is entitled Taking Away from Taking a Knee. A little more than a year ago, Colin Kaepernick became one of the most polarizing figures in the U.S. sports when he took a knee during the national anthem. It was a unique and jarring form of protest against police brutality towards African Americans. Kaepernick began his protest by sitting on the bench during the national anthem prior to a preseason game on August 14, 2016, when he was playing for the San Francisco 49ers. He was not in uniform at the time. The protest began garnering coverage when journalist Jennifer Lee Chan captured him sitting, this time in uniform, in a photograph prior to the team's third preseason game on August 26, 2016. After receiving a published open letter and speaking with Green Beret and NFL player Nate Boyer, he was convinced to take a knee rather than sit during the national anthem. From then, he has consistently taken a knee during the anthem before each game. This gesture is an acknowledgement to be having this conversation today.
You're welcome, man. I'm happy that I get to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you. So, Marlon, what were your initial reactions when you heard about Colin Kaepernick and his protest?
I was like, it's about time. I mean, I think to have somebody who's an NFL player with that platform and prestige, he went to the Super Bowl, I think, or close to the Super Bowl, and take a stand, and not only take a stand, but that he was connected to the issues that were happening in the community in terms of police violence. I was happy that somebody was able to do that, and somebody who's in the prime of their career and was doing it. Initially, he wasn't doing it for all the public, for the public to see. He was just doing his own private protest, but it mattered to him, and I think that mattered more than anything. He wasn't doing it just for show.
Mm-hmm. And so, do you think that him taking a knee was something that was long overdue, or do you think that it was done at a time where the nation was still reeling from the outcome of Freddie Gray's case, as well as other cases across the country?
Well, as I said, I think it was it's sad that in this country, any time to make a stand against police violence against black and brown bodies is always the right time, because it's always happening. And it's been happening for decades. It's been happening before Kaepernick was on this planet, before you and I were on this planet. So I think at the time, there's always the appropriate time for it. And I think particularly, he did it last year in 2016, it was in the midst of a very divisive election period, but it was also coming out of, just a couple, year out of, the Ferguson, and as you mentioned, Baltimore. Sandra Bland was still very much in everybody's memory. So, it was the right time, but it was always the right time to do these sort of things. And I think Kaepernick, his gesture was a signal to those who were watching football, and that is the masses of America, particularly those in Middle America. We call them the flyover states. To say that, well, you can support me in our ability to play sports, entertain you, but don't think that just because we're here to entertain you, that we don't have a real concern for what's happening in our communities.
And Kaepernick is one of many sports figures who utilize his platform. And some people have compared him to the likes of Muhammad Ali. And so for you, if you could hold his example up to someone who has used their platform in the past, particularly in the sports arena, who would you relate him to and why?
Well, I think Ali's a perfect form in terms of he refused to, go into the war to enlist in the military at the time when he was also at the peak of the prime of his career, and he wasn't just like ducking out the military. He had a very a real reason for why he was doing this. Like, we can't go over to kill people in Vietnam if we're not taking care of our own black and brown folks here. If I'm getting discriminated against here in Harlem, why am I going over there to fight for this country? He understood the impact of his words, but the impact of that moment, and that on a public stage, to push America to be honest with itself. And I think, so when I think about Kaepernick, and here's the other thing about it is that Ali wasn't loved at that time. He was considered unpatriotic. He was receiving death threats. He went to jail, right? They stripped him of his belt and took away his license to box. So in the same way, they blackballed Ali, they're blackballing Kaepernick because he still doesn't have a job to this day, and he's still one of the better quarterbacks out there.
So what do you think is next for Kaepernick? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about his blackballing being one of the major barriers that stops him from continuing to utilize a platform that he had access to last year. So what do you think is next for him?
I mean, I think he's trying to figure it out himself, but what I do know he's doing, I mean, just yesterday or 2 days ago, he was in Harlem with some young folks and donated a couple $1,000s to the program out there. And I know he's donated suits to people who are formerly incarcerated. So I mean, I think he's growing into himself, and he's grown into understanding that that moment is beyond just one moment, and that there's a greater purpose for him. I think he's becoming to reckon with the fact that the NFL don't want him back in there, and that there's a greater purpose for him. And his greater purpose is important because it's an awakening once again. Because as we see now, it's upsetting the owners, right? And the maniacal president can't keep him out of his tongue. Other people are taking a stand because of him. You see Jamil Hill with ESPN, who is now suspended for 2 weeks. Like he's inspiring other people who have platforms to take a stand. LeBron James is out there vocal about it. Steph Curry's out there vocal about it, and there's a slew of other folks who would normally sort of like fly under the radar, who are seeing what Kaepernick is doing and deciding like we need to stand with him. So I think in many ways, he's another one of our leaders in this moment.
When black players take a knee during the national anthem to protest police violence against African Americans, they are making a gesture of pain and distress. They are putting America in a more honest context. Quote from Kaepernick directly, "There is police brutality. People of color have been targeted by police. So that's a large part of it, and they're government officials. They are put in a place by the government. So that's something that this country has to change. There's things we can do to hold them more accountable, make those standards higher. You have people that practice law and are lawyers and go to school for 8 years, but you can become a cop in 6 months and don't have to have the same amount of training as a cosmetologist. That's insane. Someone that's holding a curling iron has more education and more training than people that have a gun and are going out there on the street to protect us." So, what are your reactions to Colin Kaepernick's comments?
First of all, you took a shot at cosmetologists just now. But I think what Kaepernick is like doing, I think, particularly with the knee, and he was advised to do that, to take that particular stance. I mean, he's trying to force America to be honest and take a look at themselves but particularly around how we've been ignoring the issues with police violence, particularly against African Americans in this country. And truth be told, one of the lesser known facts is that Native people in this country, indigenous folks per capita, are disproportionately killed at the hands of police, disproportionate to their population in this country. So it's a people of color thing in terms of police violence. It's not only African American thing, and Latinos as well. And I think like he's trying to get America to think about this and see it more honest. But even now, and this is the part of it I think, as we're living in this moment of history, is sort of very sad, is that the conversation is about the anthem and it's about the flag, and it's been taken, and it's been sort of like it's been hijacked away from what it is, that we have racial oppression and racial injustice in this country, and like black people don't feel like this country cares about them, and we got evidence to prove it, right? We got tapes, we got videotapes, we got Rodney King. We can look, we have evidence about this sort of stuff, and what Kaepernick is doing is asking America to see that in a polite way. Like he ain't kicking out anybody's doors. He's taking a knee. And now other places are doing that same thing, and America hates that. America hates the fact that folks who they are accustomed to telling what to do are now saying that we can do what we want, and we're going to protest any injustices that are coming towards us and people in our communities. America hates that. I mean, evidence shows that that America hates that sort of reckoning with that with itself.
And so, what are your thoughts around Kaepernick's point that he was making that in certain parts of this country, it is way easier to become a law enforcement official and given a firearm with all the responsibility that comes with that. And you have other professions, and he mentioned two. One is a lawyer and two is a cosmetologist, but that these folks have more higher standards in terms of the way that they're trained and the education that they receive regarding their profession. So what are your thoughts about his comments that some people are just given a gun in carte blanche?
Well, I mean, you know, it's truth, first of all, right? It's truth, but I think he's just trying to give substance to the fact that we entrusting people with our lives on the streets, and that we don't see the need for them to have further training. In fact, we're sort of okay with we're sort of okay with it, and I think that the mere fact that we're okay with it because it's not happening to in mass, it's not happening. But even beyond that, like policing in this country, as I said, for decades, pretty much since the inception of like institutional policing in this country, have been killing people of color, right? This is like part of the culture, the core of it. And I'm not saying that every cop is doing that, but it's part of the culture that people sort of step into. And there's no amount of training. This is sort of not what Catholics saying, just sort of where I'm going at it. But there's no sort of training, I think, that can stop somebody from killing somebody who they know, who they're trained to tell them you're not supposed to kill them, right? What's the brother in Staten Island?
Eric Garner.
Eric Garner. They were trained not to do that chokehold, and they did the chokehold, and the officer Pantaleo got away with it. They were trained not to beat Rodney King, not to use those swings. They beat him with those swings, and they got away with it. So training is important. We need more training. They definitely need to pay more attention to like the levels of education some of these folks have. But it's also that you can't police the police from doing what they do when they see me and you on the street corner.
At a campaign rally on September 22nd for Republican Senator Luther Strange, Trump angered many in the NFL by calling for team owners to fire any quote-unquote SOB who quote-unquote disrespects our flag. Furthermore, in tweets, Trump said, great solidarity for the national anthem and for our country. Standing with locked arms is good. Kneeling is not acceptable. Bad ratings. In another tweet, he said, if a player wants the privilege of making millions of dollars in the NFL or other leagues, he or she should not be allowed to disrespect the flag. So not only has Kaepernick taken a stance around police brutality and has been vocal on that, you've also seen other celebrities do the same thing. But now we have the president who is using that protest to shift the attention towards the national anthem specifically and the flag more peripherally. So I would love to hear your thoughts and your analysis on why it is important for us to stay focused on what the true original message was for that protest.
Well, that's the purpose of Trump's statements. The purpose of Trump's statements are to distract and to divert attention to another place. That's his way, that's his strategy, that's what he does. But it's important for us to stay on message because people are dying. I think that's why it's important for us to stay on message. People die. And not only people are physically dying, but people are harassed by police on a daily basis, largely because of what they look like. And any one of those moments can lead to another tragic moment that results in a hashtag. Any one of those moments. But beyond that, there's a level of trauma of policing in this country that is felt by people of color and doesn't care about that. And his surrogates and many of his supporters either don't care, I believe many of them don't care, and others just are unable to see the impact of police violence on communities of color. And
so Trump's tweets, there have been folks who support him, who are his surrogates, who have said things like, well, the president is utilizing his First Amendment right, the right to free speech, and he's vocalizing that, moving away from mainstream media, using Twitter specifically. But why is it, in your analysis and in your interpretation, that same critique is not given to folks like Kaepernick and other people who have protested about state-sanctioned violence? Because
that's America. That's the American way. I think the ability to ignore racism and white supremacy is like an American product. And so what Trump does through his tweets and his public comments, calling people SOBs, knowing that that's a dog whistle, and knowing that the majority of players in the league are black folks, knowing that Kaepernick is a black person, knowing that the people that he's attacked who have protested are black, whether it be Jamil Hill, Steph Curry, LeBron James. Like, he's attacked black folks, and it's not only black folks that have been criticizing him. There've been white folks who've been criticizing him too. But he's been able to focus in on black folks, and I think that speaks to, like, one, his. I mean, they vote 62 or 69 people, 62 million people, I believe, voted for him, right? And phobia, his immaturity, his inability to really speak to the issues, because he resonated, he tapped into something. Everybody is saying he's tapped into something. They've been able to ignore all the things that they wouldn't want their own child doing or their own partner saying to them, and still voted for this person. I mean, that's literally how slavery lasted so long, because people were able to ignore their own personal values. Understood that, like, to be able to align themselves with the values of somebody who fits their pockets, and ignore the fact that this person is also causing harm to many people. That's like what white supremacy looks like. That's what systemic oppression looks like. And I mean, I'm happy that folks in the NFL have done that, and I hope folks in the NBA do it. These folks have platforms. And for what it's worth, we always criticize athletes for not, you need to be a role model. You need to care about these issues. You need to take a stand. You're more than just a player. Now that they do, folks are saying, this is not the place to do it. I mean, to like someone in like Martin Luther King, like, when is the right time to do it? Like, when is the right time to sort of minimize the value of certain lives?
And so I would love to hear what your thoughts are about Jamil Hill and, you know, her being an ESPN anchor and utilizing her platform to call Trump out for what she believed him to be, which many people believe him to be, which is a white supremacist, and the fact that he supported white supremacy. But also, as you said, utilizing their weight, so to speak, in society, particularly on social media, to weigh in on these conversations.
Well, first of all, I want to know where Melania Trump is at, because she's supposed to have this whole cyberbullying thing going. I don't know where she at with this. But I think there's two things about that. You know, those in the social justice field use big terms like patriarchy, and we use white supremacy a lot. And I think we are seeing that on display right there. When you see with ESPN, there are other analysts, anchors, Stephen A. Smith, but particularly Max Kellerman, and Skip Bayless, two white anchors who have been very vocal in their critique of number 45 of Trump. And not once has he mentioned them. But when he had this one black woman who one time tweets, right, she didn't say it on air, when she tweets about one calling him a white supremacist, and then the next time tweets about you know, the way to really get at NFL owners is to get at to go after their advertisers. She tweets that, and ESPN says we now need to censor her. We need to suspend her. It's something to be said about his like, this is who he is. When his campaign, we saw some of his sexism come out, and the way how he feels towards women, how he treats women, and definitely how he speaks to people who are people of color. When you think about the judge who said wasn't fit because he was Latino. This is who he is. You understand what I'm saying? So now that Jamil Hill has used Twitter, the same platform that he uses to come at people, that he used to come at Steph Curry and so many other players, she is voicing her own voice on Twitter. Now, ESPN is saying that she violated a social media policy, but I call BS on that. And the reason why, because literally, when she made the first comment, he said she should be fired. And now 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, in the stream of time, she's now suspended. So you're gonna tell me there's no connection there, that folks aren't, I mean, that's what's systemic. Like, if we were in a history class right now, and I wish I was a history teacher at this moment, like, there's so many history lessons happening right now. There's so many ways to break down these big terms that we use, heteropatriarchy and white supremacy. We can, like, give real life examples now. We can say just follow Donald Trump's Twitter, and you'll find it all right there.
So Marlon, tell us and the listeners and the viewers more about your work that you're doing specifically to address police accountability, gun violence, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, you know, for those of us who, you know, formerly incarcerated folks, it's important over the last almost 8 years now since I've been home, from a violence interrupter to creating programming to train young people to be community organized against gun violence to be in.
And do you want to say what a violence interrupter is?
Yeah, so violence interrupter is based off of a model out of Chicago called Cure Violence, whereas that you have people who are considered credible messages, people who are of the community, people who have an understanding of like how the community works, who might have been in the streets themselves, did time. That's me, and now are interacting in the community with people who are highest risk to engage in gun violence to prevent them from shooting their guns, right? So I was trained, I was able to do that. And just a couple months after I came home, and it progressed on to now on a policy level around gun control, et cetera. But I've started focused now not only on like gun violence, preventing gun violence, but understand that there's a connection between the type of violence that we as people of color perform on each other and the type of violence that's perpetrated upon us from law enforcement. I believe that they model a certain type of violence and a certain type of harm that we now sort of internalize and push towards each other. So the work I've been doing is sort of like looking at ways to reduce gun violence and police violence at the same time. I don't believe in good faith that we can only talk about stopping each other from shooting and not address the fact that police are like putting people in a certain frame of mind of hypervigilance, but also modeling for us the type of violence that we model towards each other.
And so we have about a minute or so left. Do you want to say a little bit more about the Decarcerated podcast?
Yeah, you were a guest on that. The Decarcerated podcast, yeah, check it out. It's everywhere you can find it on iTunes, SoundCloud, et cetera. The Decarcerated podcast highlights the journeys of success of people who spend time in jails and prisons. I firmly believe, as you have this media platform, that we're, as formerly incarcerated folks, there are many parts of our stories, and there's many parts of our journeys, and they aren't all dark. But even through that darkness is light. And I believe that we are not only should be people who are on shows and speaking and being interviewed, but we should create these platforms. So the podcast is a platform where that as a formerly incarcerated person, I get to speak with other folks who are formerly incarcerated about their journeys of success. And you've been a guest, and you had a lot of great people on the show. And this is our second season in motion now. And a new episode comes out every Friday. So you can download the podcast on.
And how can folks listen, learn more about the Decarcerated podcast, about your work? Where can they go to learn more?
So you go to my website, marlonpeterson.com. You can find all the episodes there, and you can find out more about my work as well as my writing, which I take a lot of pride in. The podcast is available everywhere you can download podcasts: iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, anywhere you can find it. Well,
thank you, Marlon, for being our guest. And thank you for the important work that you do each day. And thank you for standing with us in solidarity as we support the NFL players, Jamil Hill and other celebrities who are dedicated to the original cause of ending police brutality and creating accountability. And thank you, the viewers, for joining us on Manhattan Neighborhood Network and in TV Land as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in The Fortune Society. This is Khalil Cumberbatch as we critically look at both sides of the bars.
Detention Center for Unaccompanied Minors, run by the nonprofit Southwest Key Programs, which also runs the Brownsville facility and the proposed baby jail in Houston, 27 facilities in all. Antar Davidson quit after he says Southwest Key forced him to tell children who are separated from their mother and from their siblings not to hug. Antar Davidson, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about why you quit your job last week?
Sure, definitely. Thank you first and foremost, Amy, for having me on the show. I just want to clarify a little bit the timeline of events. That first night when they told me not to hug, that prompted me to seek change internally. I reached out to a regional director who assured me that the next morning, she assured me that things would change, things would be different. 4 more Brazilians came. I found it extremely difficult. I tried to help through the organization. I tried to talk to people, and despite being a Brazilian citizen and having had professional translation work, they did not allow me to help. They really were blocking me at every turn. I then requested a leave, a time off, a week off to process what I had gone through. And prior to that, the CEO, Dr. Juan Sanchez, made his rounds and began asking for money. And after they denied my leave request, it was then that I made I put in my resignation as a conscientious objector. So
I don't understand what you said, Antar. You said he was asking for money?
Yes. So they called mandatory meetings at our facility, 3 different mandatory meetings. And he initially said that they're 500 more people. They're going to drop the ratio from 1 to 5 to 1 to 3 for the tender age kids. So that refers to the direct care ratios, so that they would have more staff to take care of those younger kids. 500 kids, 500 new employees he said he needed. He told then a sob story about a minor who went to a facility with very thick knee, and how he felt so bad. Despite making $1 million plus between him and his wife in federal tax dollars, he said that he felt so bad that he couldn't do anything for this child with acne, and proceeded to basically present this employee giving program where employees and staff were urged to give $10 of every paycheck, or a one-time contribution of $240. He then had a second speaker kind of reinforce the policy while passing around papers for people to sign away their checks. I just definitely want to clarify that despite, of course, the acute problems of the zero tolerance policy, but also we shouldn't let this CEO off the hook, who's been making $1 million plus for the past 5 years off the detention of children, of vulnerable immigrant children.
So, Antar, can you talk about this moment? You talked about speaking Portuguese. You're Brazilian. Talk about the moment where you were with these children that so disturbed you. Describe the scene.
Well, it was pretty much a day of being shown a very uncompassionate organization claiming to be a humanitarian nonprofit. The children were separated from their mother, and that the next day, at 2 in the morning, they left, I believe it was a facility in Texas. They arrived at the Tucson facility at 9:30 in the morning, having not had slept the entire night. They were showered, fed, they went through the intake process.
Next on PPMtv, Deutsche Welle Global 3000.
This week on Global 3000, we're off to the steppes of Mongolia, where intensive livestock farming is destroying land and livelihoods. What can be done about it? We head to Chicago, a city with a sky-high murder rate and a west side blighted by drugs, gangs and despair. But first to Eastern Kenya, the Al-Shabaab terror group recruits there heavily, sowing the seeds of mistrust among locals. Al-Shabaab arose in 2006 in the midst of a bloody civil war in Somalia. Its aim to establish an Islamic emirate stretching beyond the country's own borders. But now the group has been pushed back to Somalia's southern areas and driven out of key urban centres like the capital, Mogadishu. Al-Shabaab is allied with Al-Qaeda, a terror network notorious for suicide bombings, guerrilla warfare and a rigid interpretation of Sharia law. While exact figures are hard to come by, experts believe Al-Shabaab has between 7,000 and 9,000 members. Many of them come from neighbouring Kenya. That's led to increased prejudice against Muslims there. But now a group of women is doing some pushing back of their own.
Making soap to make money and as a healing exercise. These women are victims of Al-Shabaab. Some were kidnapped and abused, while others have family members who joined the group.
People consider us the enemy because of things other people have done. They call me Al-Shabaab just because two of my brothers joined the group.
The pain of loss, stigmatization by neighbors, and no support from the government or from police.
If the police suspect that there are terrorists around, then they react very harshly and immediately start killing people, especially if they think a young man is an Al-Shabaab member. That's why a lot of people don't turn them in, even if they're guilty.
Fatuma Shafi speaks from experience. Her husband was a policeman, but he was shot dead by colleagues after he began searching for their son who had disappeared. The 14-year-old was suspected of traveling to Somalia to join Al-Shabaab. The group has carried out gruesome attacks in Somalia and in Kenya, killing and wounding hundreds. The Islamists are angry at the Kenyan government for supporting Somalia's crackdown on Al-Shabaab. The group recruits along the Kenyan coast, an area popular with tourists from around the world. Radicalization is a huge problem here, and police respond with violence. Many Kenyans are afraid to even enter a police station for fear of seeming suspicious themselves. It wasn't easy to get permission to film here. Officer Bibaron Ganguma finally agreed. She says she became a police officer to serve society, not to work against it. Her office in Mombasa is a safe place for many people, especially women. She promises to help them with their problems. This should be a given, but it's not always the case in Kenya. The police often have a reputation as thugs or the enemy, not as friends and helpers. Or they take bribes for favors. Officer Ganguma tries to relate to people as equals.
There is a big gap between us and the community. I always put it this way: that woman is the bridge between the community and us policewomen.
She tells us further, most of the time when women come and have information, they are afraid to reveal it. The women are afraid of being branded a traitor or of colluding with the police. Fatuma Shafi didn't get any help from the police after her husband was shot dead. She supports her family by selling baked goods. And she volunteers in her community as a kind of peace ambassador.
If the police want something, then they should do it in a gentle way, the way you come down a baby. Prison and violence only breed hatred. We want to get rid of this hate. We want to be friendly.
Those are the words of a woman who watched her husband killed by his colleagues and who has lost a son to a terror group.
At one point they told me my son was dead. I've made peace with this. If he'd returned, he might have been a bad influence on others.
Despite, or perhaps because of this horrifying story, Fatuma Shafi spends her life fighting hatred. That's taken her on an unusual path. She's joined with Bibaron Ganguma and other peace ambassadors. Today they venture into a neighborhood with a heavy Al-Shabaab presence. At first people are skeptical of the police uniform. A woman complains that she is always being harassed by police officers, but she's also mistreated by gangs making trouble. Bibaron tells her that women should always report such things to the police. They're people like you, she says, they'll understand you.
It's good that she came. Many of us were scared at first. It makes it easier for us to share our concerns. It's very different from going to the police station.
The Kenyan police are ramping up their presence on the coast. The goal is to approach the people and listen to them, rather than driving them away. But Officer Ganguma is an exceptional police officer. She's always on duty, even while making breakfast.
we're not talking about an organization that was good. We're talking about an organization that for the past 5 years has made millions of dollars in basically the
and your
retention of youth.
response to the same, the nonprofit you work for, Southwest Key, opening what they're calling a baby jail in Houston. The mayor was protesting. The former police chief was protesting yesterday in the pouring rain. The lease of a former homeless shelter in Houston by the nonprofit you work for, Southwest Key, to use this jail, separating children at a tender age of 10 or below. 10 or younger.
Follow the money. Yeah, follow the money. There's going to be, I promise you, there'll be millions made in various people's hands, and I think that's what's perhaps most insidious about this. This is an organization that presents itself as doing a humanitarian deed and this and that. This is a federal level responsibility that they're taking on at great cost, and you need to do it right. It's not something that you should laud yourself, especially if you're making a lot of money. Again, follow the money. There's a lot of money being made off of this situation, and it's important that we hold all those people accountable and basically as a nation show we need to integrate people. We need to provide quality mental health services, particularly because these children are being reunified and placed into public schools. If we turn these facilities into prisons, if we don't provide the proper education and preparation for them, upon reunification, we're basically creating a prison to public school pipeline, and that it will be detrimental to everyone.
Antar Davidson, I thank you for being with us. Antar Davidson is a whistleblower who quit his job last week as a youth worker at the Estrella del Norte, that's North Star facility for unaccompanied minors and separated children. This one in Tucson, Arizona, the facility run by the nonprofit Southwest Key Programs. That's the company that also runs the 1,500 child facility in Texas. Davidson is also field director for Arizona State Representative Pam Powers Henley. This is Democracy Now! As we continue to look at the growing outrage over President Trump's policy of separating immigrant children from their parents. We turn to the political showdown in Washington. On Saturday, President Trump tried to blame the widely condemned family separation practice. Democrats tweeting, Democrats can fix their forced family breakup at the border by working with Republicans on new legislation. On Thursday, House Republicans introduced a so-called compromise immigration bill alongside a more conservative alternative. The plan includes the promise of a $25 billion for Trump's border wall and is being touted as a way for Democrats to agree to pass legislation that would stop the separation of families. For more on what the Democrats might do now as they condemn the Trump administration's new policy of separating families at the border, we're joined by Renee Feltz, Democracy Now! Correspondent and producer, who's long reported on the criminalization of immigrants, family detention, and the business of detention. She just came back from South Texas. Renee, it's great to be speaking to you again. So President Trump, in tweet and in speaking to reporters, says it's the Democrats' fault. It's the Democrats' fault, as everyone is shouting back. But you've instituted this zero-tolerance policy.
That's right. So Trump is trying to say this isn't their policy. The Democrats made us do it. One of his advisors, Stephen Miller, is actually saying it is our policy to do it. His head of Department of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, is saying we're not actually doing it. And then Attorney General Jeff Sessions is saying God wants us to do it. So, you know, that's where we are in terms of the responsibility here. But as a reporter, I've been following the money, as Antar referred to earlier, with the business of detention under the Obama administration for some time here on Democracy Now! And many reporters like myself are recalling this history of family detention under previous administrations, not so much to toot our own horn and say we were right, but more to say this is how Democrats have previously compromised on the issue of how we handle the surge of migrants coming to our country to seek asylum. In 2014, President Obama, as we reported here on Democracy Now!, opened detention centers for families. And his approach was to keep the moms with the children when they came together, although there was some consideration at that time of separating the families, but they didn't.
As a scientist, and also as a human being, I've been trying to make myself susceptible to wonder. I think Jason Webley last night called it conspiring to be part of the magic. So it's fortunate that my career as a biologist lets me dive deeply into the lives of some truly wondrous creatures that share our planet. Fireflies. Now, for many of you, I know that fireflies might conjure up some really great memories. Childhood, summertime, even other TED Talks. Maybe something like this. My seduction into the world of fireflies began when I was back in graduate school. One evening, I was sitting out in my backyard in North Carolina, and suddenly, these silent sparks rose up all around me, and I began to wonder, how do these creatures make light? And what's with all this flashing? Are they talking to one another? And what happens after the lights go out? I've been lucky enough to answer some of these questions as I've explored this nocturnal world. Now, if you've ever seen or even heard about fireflies, then you'll know how magically they can transform our everyday landscape into something ethereal and otherworldly. And this happens around the globe, like this hillside in the Smoky Mountains that I saw transformed into a living cascade of light by the eerie glows of these blue ghost fires. Or Side River that I visited in Japan as it was giving birth to the slow, floating flashes of these Genji fireflies. Or in Malaysia, the mangrove trees that I watched blossom nightly, not with flowers, but with the lights of 1,000 cleep-cleep fireflies, all blinking together in stunning synchrony. These luminous landscapes still fill me with wonder, and they keep me connected to the magic of the natural world. And I find it amazing that they're created by these tiny insects. In person, fireflies are charming. They're charismatic. They've been celebrated in art and in poetry for centuries. As I've traveled around the world, I've met many thoughtful people who've told me that God put fireflies on Earth for humans to enjoy. Other creatures can enjoy them too. I think these graceful insects are truly miraculous because they so beautifully illuminate the creative improvisation of evolution. They've been shaped by two powerful evolutionary forces: natural selection, the struggle for survival, and sexual selection, the struggle for reproductive opportunity. As a firefly junkie, the past 20 years have been quite an exciting ride. Together with my students at Tufts University and other colleagues, we've made lots of new discoveries about fireflies: their courtship and sex lives, their treachery and murder. So today I'd like to share with you just a couple of tales that we've brought back from our collective adventures into this hidden world. Fireflies belong to a very beautiful and diverse group of insects, the beetles. Worldwide, there are more than 2,000 firefly species, and these have evolved remarkably diverse courtship signals, that is, different ways to find and attract mates. Around 150 million years ago, the very first fireflies probably looked like this. They flew during the daytime, and they didn't light up. Instead, males used their fantastic antennae to sniff out perfumes given off by their females. In other fireflies, it's only the females who light up. They're attractively plump and wingless. So every night, they climb up onto perches, and they glow brightly for hours to attract their flying but unlit males. In still other fireflies, both sexes use quick, bright flashes to find their mates. Here in North America, we have more than 100 different kinds of firefly that have the remarkable ability to shine energy out from their bodies in the form of light. How do they do that? It seems totally magical. But these bioluminescent signals arise from carefully orchestrated chemical reactions that happen inside the firefly lantern. The main star is an enzyme called luciferase, which in the course of evolution has figured out a way to wrap its tiny arms around an even smaller molecule called luciferin, in the process getting it so excited that it actually gives off light. Incredible. But how could these bright lights have benefited some proto-firefly? To answer this question, we need to flip back in the family album to some baby pictures. Fireflies completely reinvent their bodies as they grow. They spend the vast majority of their lifetime, up to 2 years, in this larval form. Their main goal here, like my teenagers, is to eat and grow. And firefly light first originated in these juveniles. Every single firefly larva can light up, even when their adults can't. But what's the point to being so conspicuous? Well, we know that these juveniles make nasty-tasting chemicals that help them survive their extended childhood. So we think these lights first evolved as a warning, a neon sign that says, "Toxic, stay away," to any would-be predators. It took many million years before these bright lights evolved into a smart communication tool that could be used not just to ward off potential predators, but to bring in potential mates. Driven now by sexual selection, some adult fireflies, like this proud male, evolved a shiny new glow-in-the-dark lantern that would let them take courtship to a whole new level. These adults only live a few weeks, and now they're single-mindedly focused on sex. That is, on propelling their genes into the next firefly generation. So we can follow this male out into the field as he joins hundreds of other males who are all showing off their new courtship signals. It's amazing to think that the luminous displays we admire here and in fact everywhere around the world are actually the silent love songs of male fireflies. They're flying and flashing their hearts out. I still find it very romantic. But meanwhile, where are all the females? Well, they're lounging down below, surveying their options. They have plenty of males to choose from, and these females turn out to be very picky. When a female sees a flash from an especially attractive male, she'll aim her lantern in his direction and give him a flash back. It's her come hither sign. So he flies closer and he flashes again. If she still likes him, they'll strike up a conversation. These creatures speak their love in the language of light. So what exactly do these females consider sexy? We decided to conduct some firefly opinion polls to find out. When we tested females using blinking LED lights, we discovered they prefer males who give longer lasting flashes. I know you're wondering what gives these males their sex appeal. Now we get to see what happens when the lights go out. The first thing we discovered is that once a male and female hook up like this, they stay together all night long. And when we looked inside to see what might be happening, we discovered a surprising new twist to firefly sex. While they're mating, the male is busy giving the female not just his sperm, but also a nutrient-filled package called a nuptial gift. We can zoom in to look more closely inside this mating pair. We can actually see the gift, it's shown here in red, as it's being passed from the male to the female. What makes this gift so valuable is that it's packed with protein that the female will use to provision her eggs. So females are keeping their eyes on this prize as they size up potential mates. We discovered that females use male flash signals to try to predict which males have the biggest gifts to offer, because this bling helps the female lay more eggs and ultimately launch more of her own offspring into the next generation. So it's not all sweetness and light. Firefly romance is risky. For the most part, these adult fireflies don't get eaten because, like their juveniles, they can manufacture toxins that are repellent to birds and other insectivores. But somewhere along the line, one particular group of fireflies somehow lost the metabolic machinery needed to make their own protective toxins. This evolutionary flaw, which was discovered by my colleague Tom Eisner, has driven these fireflies to take their bright lights out into the night with treacherous intent. Dubbed femme fatale by Jim Lloyd, another colleague, these females have figured out how to target the males of other firefly species. So the hunt begins with the predator. She's shown here in the lower left, where she's sitting quietly and eavesdropping on the courtship conversation of her intended prey. And here's how it might go. First, the prey male flashes. "Do you love me?" His own female responds, "Maybe." So then he flashes again. But this time, the predator sneaks in a reply that cleverly mimics exactly what the other female just said. She's not looking for love. She's looking for toxins. If she's good, she can lure this male close enough to reach out and grab him. And he's not just a light snack. Over the next hour, she slowly exsanguinates this male, leaving behind just some gory remains. Unable to make their own toxins, these females resort to drinking the blood of other fireflies to get these protective chemicals. So, a firefly vampire, brought to you by natural selection. We still have a lot to learn about fireflies, but it looks like many stories will remain untold, because around the world, firefly populations are blinking out. The main culprit? Habitat loss. Pretty much everywhere, the fields and forests, the mangroves and meadows that fireflies need to survive are giving way to development and to sprawl. Here's another problem. We've conquered darkness, but in the process, we spill so much extra light out into the night that it disrupts the lives of other creatures. And fireflies are especially sensitive to light pollution because it obscures the signals that they use to find their mates. Do we really need fireflies? After all, they're just one tiny bit of Earth's biodiversity. Yet, every time a species is lost, it's like extinguishing a room full of candles, one by one. You might not notice when the first few flames flicker out. But in the end, you're left sitting in darkness. As we work together to craft a planetary future, I hope we can find a way to keep these bright lights shining. Thank you.
Anniversary of the Iraq War, these 55 senators voted to continue waging war on Yemen. They voted to continue starving millions to death. They voted to continue bombing Yemenis with U.S. bombs dropped by Saudi-purchased U.S. jets, refueled midair by the U.S. Army. Hashtag SJRes54. Can you explain the Senate resolution, what Senate Resolution 54 called for, and what you feel needs to happen right now?
So SJRes was such an incredible opportunity to once and for all extricate the U.S. from what they're doing in Yemen, from helping the Saudi Arabians wage this war on a country that doesn't pose any threat to Saudi Arabia, the U.S., or any other country. It was a civil war that they got themselves involved in. And if they had voted in favor of this bill, the U.S. had to legally then, remove themselves. We know that there's U.S. special forces on the ground in Saudi Arabia helping with this mission. There's refueling, there's sales of weapons, and so on. But it didn't go through. They ended up voting to table it, and those 55 senators voted to table the bill. They didn't even end up voting on it. And here was this incredible opportunity to end the war, because given how involved the U.S. is in Yemen and how dependent the Saudi-led coalition is on the support of the United States, this war cannot continue being waged much longer without U.S. support. So
you're saying that the U.S. is facilitating this war?
Absolutely. In Yemen, this is seen as a U.S.-Saudi war on their country. This is not just the Saudis and Emiratis waging war. The Emiratis and the Saudis.
Next on PPMtv, Democracy Now!
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! The U.S. suicide rate has risen 25% over the past decades, in some places as high as 59%. That's according to a new report by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The findings come as two high-profile suicides occurred within days of each other last week. Celebrity chef and television host Anthony Bourdain and designer Kate Spade. We'll speak to Dr. John Mann, past president of the International Academy of Suicide Research. Then it's been 50 years since the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy.
A society in which Negroes will be as free as other Americans, free to vote and to learn and to earn their way and to share in the decisions of government, which in turn shapes their lives.
We'll speak with Michael Eric Dyson about his new book, What Truth Sounds Like, Robert F. Kennedy, James Baldwin, and our unfinished conversation about race in America. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have arrived in Singapore ahead of Tuesday's summit, slated to be the first-ever meeting between an American president and a North Korean leader. The summit will be held at the Capella Resort on Sentosa Island. Trump is slated to meet for 2 hours alone with Kim Jong-un, along with just their two translators. Hours ago, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo held a news conference in which he said Trump is prepared to offer North Korea unprecedented security assurances, although he did not specify what these guarantees would be. The official North Korean news agency said Sunday Kim is prepared to talk about denuclearization and a durable peace. Meanwhile, President Trump told reporters Saturday he would know within the first minute of their meeting whether Kim is serious about making peace.
It's a good question. How long will it take? I think within the first minute, I'll know. Just my touch, my feel. That's what I do. How long will it take to figure out whether or not they're serious? I said maybe in the first minute. You know, the way they say that you know if you're going to like somebody in the first 5 seconds. You ever hear that one? Well, I think that very quickly I'll know whether or not something good is going to happen.
That was President Trump speaking to reporters Saturday at a news conference at the G7 summit in Quebec. He was speaking shortly before leaving the summit early, avoiding a meeting with other world leaders about climate change. Trump was isolated throughout the two-day summit, a position captured in a now viral photo of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, flanked by other world leaders, standing over Trump, who stares back at her with National Security Advisor John Bolton by his side. After Trump departed the G7 summit early, he attacked Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in a series of tweets in which he called Trudeau meek and mild and dishonest and weak. But on Sunday, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro further attacked Trudeau over his resistance to U.S. tariffs. This is Navarro speaking to Chris Wallace on Fox News.
Chris, there's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. And that's what bad faith Justin Trudeau did with that stunt press conference. That's what weak, dishonest Justin Trudeau did. And that comes right from Air Force One. And I'll tell you this. To my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history.
In Gaza, Israeli soldiers killed 4 Palestinians and wounded 600 more during the Palestinians' nonviolent protests Friday along the separation fence with Israel. Among those killed was a 15-year-old boy named Haitham al-Jamal. Photos also went viral of another Palestinian protester being shot in the face with a tear gas canister. He remains in critical condition. The Israeli military has killed at least 124 Palestinians and wounded over 14,000 others since the Palestinian nonviolent Great March of Return protests began on March 30th. The Pentagon says U.S. Special Operations soldier Alexander Conrad of Chandler, Arizona, was killed in southwestern Somalia on Friday. The Pentagon says he and fellow troops were attacked by the militant group al-Shabaab. 4 other U.S. soldiers were wounded. There are reportedly about 500 U.S. troops stationed in Somalia. The United Nations is warning of escalated fighting in the Syrian province of Idlib, where 2.5 million civilians are trapped. The Idlib Media Center says 44 civilians were killed by Russian airstrikes in the village of Zardana on Thursday. The White Helmets say at least 16 more people were killed by Syrian government airstrikes over the weekend. The Red Cross has evacuated 71 staff members from Yemen amidst rising threats and security risks to its aid workers. Hundreds more Red Cross workers remain inside Yemen. The Wall Street Journal reported last week the United States is weighing expanding its role in the ongoing war in Yemen, which has killed 15,000 civilians, sparked the world's worst cholera epidemic with more than 1 million Yemenis affected, and pushed the country to the brink of famine. Back in the United States, media reports have revealed a Honduran asylum seeker who was separated from his wife and 3-year-old child after crossing the border died by suicide in mid-May after strangling himself in a jail in Starr County, Texas. A Border Patrol agent told the Washington Post Marco Antonio Munoz lost it after agents told him he'd be separated from his child and that the agents then, quote, used physical force to take the child out of his hands, unquote. When Munoz continued to protest the physical removal of his son, the agency transferred him to a nearby jail, where a guard found him dead in his cell the following morning. The news of Munoz's death comes as resistance is mounting to the Trump administration's policy of separating children from their parents at the border. Washington Congressmember Pramila Jayapal blasted the administration after visiting women asylum seekers detained at the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport.
Half or more of these women had children that were forcibly separated from them. They were never given a chance to say goodbye to their children. The vast majority of these mothers do not even know where their children are. What I saw was absolutely horrific, what I saw and heard. And we have always had problems with the criminalization of immigrants, but this is a blow to take folks who are asylum seekers and throw them into a facility, not provide them with any access to basic human rights, and worst of all, to separate mothers from their children.
And in more immigration news, a federal judge in Manhattan has temporarily halted the deportation of Pablo Villavicencio, the delivery worker who was arrested by ICE last week after dropping off a pizza at the Fort Hamilton Army base. His deportation to Ecuador has been stayed until July 20th. Pope Francis appealed directly to top oil company executives to help avert the global catastrophe of climate change during a 2-day summit at the Vatican.
I encourage you, having demonstrated your aptitude for innovation and for improving the lives of many people by your creativeness and professional expertise, to use those skills in the service of 2 great needs in today's world, the care of the poor and care for the environment. I invite you to be the core of a group of leaders who envision the global energy transition in a way that will take into account all the peoples of the earth, as well as future generations and all species and all ecosystems.
Among those in attendance was the heads of BP, ExxonMobil, and the Italian energy giant Eni. In more environmental news, the Indian government has vowed to eliminate single-use plastic items by 2022, making it the latest of at least 60 countries that have introduced bans or fines aimed at reducing plastics pollution. The company IKEA also announced Thursday it will eliminate single-use plastic items by 2020. Thousands of women in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales poured into the streets Sunday to celebrate the suffragette movement. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the British 1918 Representation of the People Act, which granted property-owning British women over age 30 the right to vote. In the Philippines, press freedom groups are condemning the murder of journalist Dennis Denora, who was shot dead Thursday in the southern region of Mindanao. He was the editor and publisher of the weekly community newspaper Trends and Times. The Philippines is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. Award-winning actor Robert De Niro slammed President Trump during the Tony Awards Sunday night here in New York.
I'm going to say one thing, Trump. It's no longer down with Trump, it's Trump. Now I'll get to this my introduction.
Students who survived the Valentine's Day massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School also performed during the Tony Awards, singing Seasons of Love from the hit musical Rent. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A new report by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has found the U.S. suicide rate rose by 25% over the past 2 decades. Topping the list was North Dakota, where suicides have risen by 57% from 1999 levels. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. The report found nearly 45,000 suicides occurred in the United States in 2016, more than twice the number of homicides. Firearms accounted for 51% of all suicides in the same year. Among people ages 15 to 34, suicide was the second leading cause of death. While suicide rates have risen in all but one state, researchers have found states with strict gun laws have some of the lowest suicide rates. This includes New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Connecticut. The findings come as 2 high-profile suicides occurred within days of each other last week. Celebrity chef and television host Anthony Bourdain died by suicide Friday. The 61-year-old was found dead in his hotel room near Strasbourg, France, where he was filming an episode of his CNN program, Parts Unknown. He was found hanging to death. Bourdain's death came just days after fashion designer Kate Spade was found dead in her Manhattan apartment in an apparent suicide as well, again hung to death in the bathroom. Meanwhile, media reports have revealed that a Honduran asylum seeker who was separated from his wife and 3-year-old child after crossing the border died by suicide in mid-May after strangling himself in a jail in Starr County, Texas. A Border Patrol agent told the Washington Post Marco Antonio Munoz lost it after agents told him he'd be separated from his child, and the agents then, quote, used physical force to take the child out of his hands. To talk more about this public health crisis, we're joined by Dr. John Mann, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and a division director at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He's past president of the International Academy of Suicide Research and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. John Mann, welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you. Good morning.
It's good to have you with us. Can you talk about this rising rate of suicide?
Well, it's, of course, extremely alarming. Especially because suicide is such a major cause of death, particularly in young people. So people are cut short in the prime of their lives. The context of this is not that the United States is sharing this problem with the rest of the world. It's quite different. The United States has had a steadily rising suicide rate for 2 decades. Much of the rest of the world has had a declining suicide rate. So we are going very much in the wrong direction.
And what do you think accounts for this?
Well, several things. First of all, you mentioned North Dakota. There's a clue there. North Dakota has very few psychiatrists, very little psychiatric services. It's a fairly rural state. without much medical infrastructure, for example, as the other states that you mentioned, like on the East Coast, New York, Connecticut, etc., Massachusetts. And so people don't have access to health care. Why does that matter for suicide? It matters because suicide, in the majority of cases, is a complication of an untreated psychiatric illness. That means nobody made the diagnosis, and most of these people, meaning over 70% of them, die untreated.
You talked about there being fewer psychiatric and psychological services in these places, also stricter gun control laws.
Well, there are a number of factors that contribute to suicide. First of all, if you don't have a diagnosable psychiatric illness, your chances of dying by suicide are very tiny. So first of all, you have to have a diagnosable psychiatric illness. When you have that, all kinds of social factors become much more important. Even within individuals who have a psychiatric illness, it is only a subgroup that are at particular risk. So we try to focus on who that subgroup is in order to focus our main prevention efforts on the people who need the most help. It's not that easy to find that subgroup, and that's what research is all about.
So white males account for 7 of 10 suicides. That was in 2016. Why is this demographic the greatest risk? White young men.
So male suicide rates are 3.5 times higher than females in the United States. But it's not quite that simple. The pattern is different, and we don't really understand why males commit suicide so much more frequently than females. And the pattern is different in the sense that male suicide rates are pretty constant after late teenagehood through into the 60s. And then once males enter the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the suicide rate begins to climb again quite dramatically. But it's quite different in women. Women have a gradual rise to in suicide rates to midlife, and then it begins to decline. So it's actually going in a very different direction. We've tried to understand the differences. There are biological differences in the brain in women compared to men, and they're reflected in behavioral differences. Men are more prone to violence against others, and as well as against themselves. But another big factor, we think, is help seeking. Women are more prepared to seek help, more prepared to say, I have a problem and I need help with this. Men, culturally, socially, find that a more difficult step to take, and men are poorer at getting help for themselves.
We've seen for years now this phenomenon in the United States that is unusual in the world, and this is mass killings, most usually perpetrated by young white men. Young white men who, by the way, before that have more often than not inflicted pain on a woman in their life, maybe their mother or a girlfriend, or in these high school shootings, stalking a girlfriend or someone that they perceive they wanted to be their partner. Do you see a connection between suicides and these mass shootings?
Yes, there's definitely an important connection. For many years, there was a phenomenon that was pretty uncommon called homicide-suicide, where individuals would die by suicide, but before they died, they killed other people, usually multiple people, usually people they had some connection with or knew, meaning family, girlfriend, employee, fellow employees. But there's been a new phenomenon that's emerged strikingly, which are these mass killings using automatic weapons and high-capacity cartridges, which allow people to kill a lot of others in a very short period of time. So this has now become kind of a copycat thing. Many, but not all, of these individuals end up dying by suicide, by their own hand. This is now what you might regard as an extreme form of homicide-suicide. These are individuals who are filled with a lot of anger and depression. So the first thing that they do is express their anger by killing other innocent people around them, and the second step is killing themselves. It's a rare form of suicide. Unfortunately, a lot of innocent people die as well, so it garners a lot of attention. That's appropriate, of course. But in the bigger picture of preventing suicide, if one prevented all of these events from happening, one would only prevent a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the 45,000 or so people in the US who die every year.
I mean, this is an absolutely shocking number. 45,000 people die a year, more than twice the number of homicides.
Yes, this is true worldwide. Worldwide, it's estimated that about 600,000 people die in wars of all sorts. But it's estimated somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people die every year worldwide due to suicide. Those of us who've been working in this field have been a kind of a voice in the wilderness trying to help the public understand that suicide is such a terrible threat and causes such loss of life.
And what about the racial disparities? We're talking about mainly young white men die by suicide. I also, in a moment, want to ask why the language has changed and why you don't say commit suicide, but die by suicide. But what about racial disparities?
So race seems to make a difference. We're not entirely sure, again, what the reasons are. For example, the community that's most imperiled are North American Indians in the United States. In Canada, our allies to the north, the community that's most imperiled are the Inuits. In Australia, Australian Aborigines. So somehow these groups are particularly at risk. Now, it's true that they also have greater problems with things like substance use and alcohol use disorders, et cetera, but they're definitely at greater risk.
And does poverty weigh in?
Poverty has an effect, for sure. We know that one of the reasons why there are big differences across the United States when you look at suicide by zip code or county level. Part of the reason for those differences are the quality of medical care and the availability of medical care. But even if you have medical care available, part of the reason for the difference in suicide rates is related to per capita income. If people can't afford to pay for health care, then you can have the best health care in your neighborhood, but it doesn't do you any good. The United States is distinguished from much of the Western world by not having universal health care coverage.
The words die by suicide, committing suicide, why do people now refrain from saying committing?
Well, this is part of the stigma associated with suicide. For many, many years, and until relatively recently in our history, suicide was regarded as a crime. It was listed as a crime on the statutes. So you commit murder and you commit suicide. Suicide was regarded as self-murder. There's a long theological background to this kind of thinking. And so this was a terrible problem in terms of reaching out to these people and offering them help. We know now in many religions that the theological view of suicide has changed. It's now regarded as the act of an ill person and therefore not a sin, and those people and their families should be treated just the same as people who have died of any other cause.
Opioid addiction.
Yes, this is a huge problem in the US. Probably has contributed to the rise in suicide rates more recently. Our rise in suicide rates has been going on for 2 decades, steadily. So opioid addiction is not the explanation of what's happened. It is one contributing factor. Just as the economic recession in 2008, which occurred after the suicide rate was clearly rising, is one potential factor, but not the explanation. The opioid epidemic is a medical disaster. It contributes to suicide rates, but it is not the sole driver.
Dr. Mann, I wanted to ask you about suicide prevention, the most important question. What are the most effective ways to prevent suicide?
So the critical thing to know is that suicide is highly preventable. That when we have organized, targeted programs, we can produce a significant decrease in suicide rates. We've shown this in a number of ways in different communities and countries, depending on the causal factors. The causal factors vary from place to place. For example, we've now shown at county levels and even at city levels that if you improve physicians' capacity for diagnosing and treating major depression, which is the psychiatric causal factor in 60% of the suicides with psychiatric disorders, and 90% of all suicides occur in the context of a psychiatric disorder. If you just train physicians to better recognize depression and treat it more effectively, you will lower the suicide rate. We know this for a fact. It's been demonstrated in multiple studies in multiple countries. It's not a matter of training the psychiatrists. Most adults are treated by their GPs, their internists, or their OBGYN specialists. We need to train non-psychiatrist physicians to diagnose and treat suicidal people better. We have to remember that about 40% of all suicides see their doctor within 30 days of dying by suicide, and about 80% see their doctor within 12 months. So what is the suicidal patient saying to their doctor? They're probably talking about physical symptoms, when those physical symptoms actually represent a depression with physical symptoms. They don't mention they're depressed. If the doctor doesn't ask, the patient doesn't think to tell them. So that's one very important thing. But what else can we do in the United States? Well, the obvious thing are guns. People need to know that the more available the gun is, the more likely it is to be used in a suicide. Homes with more guns have more firearm suicides. Homes with guns have more firearm suicides than homes without guns. Your chance of getting killed with a gun or a family member dying with a gun in a suicide is much greater than any chance of an intruder getting killed with that gun. So guns don't make people safe. They actually are a two-edged sword. They place everybody in the household at risk.
So you compare attempted suicide with suicide. We don't usually see those numbers. And you'd be less likely to die if you attempted it another way.
If you attempt suicide and survive, more than 80% of those individuals never die by suicide, which makes it very important to, if you like, shift people from the most lethal methods to the least lethal methods, because you can save a lot of lives that way. Guns are an extremely lethal method of suicide. The chance of surviving a self-inflicted gunshot wound is very low, so that these people don't get a second chance. In countries, which is most of the Western world, where guns are much less available, they are much safer. Their commonest method of suicide is hanging or overdose, and the chances of survival are much better.
For family members, friends, teachers, what is recommended when you see someone in pain?
So we don't expect families and schoolmates and fellow employees and students to be able to diagnose who is going to be at risk for suicide. That's unrealistic. However, expression of suicidal thoughts, or life isn't worth living, or giving away valued possessions, or examining their will or their insurance, these are signs that people are thinking of closure in their life, which is a bad thing. And it's like a fever. A person has a bit of a fever. You don't know, as their family member or best friend, is that a pneumonia? Is that an overwhelming infection? Or is that just an upper respiratory tract viral infection, which is of no consequence? So what do people do in those circumstances? They go and ask somebody who does know. Go and see the nurse, go and see the doctor, nurse practitioner, somebody, and get checked out. It's the same. If somebody says that they've got suicidal thoughts, this could be lethal. It mightn't be, but you don't know. It's hard to tell. They should go and talk to somebody who knows. We have hotlines, phone lines, suicide helplines available throughout the United States 24/7. We have emergency rooms with experts who can tell the difference with a reasonable degree of certainty 24/7. People should go and ask and get help.
Is there a suicide hotline that you give out?
It's the suicide hotline. You can find that everywhere. It's on, to their credit, on Google, on Facebook. When you do use a search engine to ask about suicide, it's everywhere.
And finally, we're talking about 123 suicides a day in the United States, the average from 45,000 a year. We talked about Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade. These make it high profile, so suicide gets more attention. And then you have the case of this migrant father who has his child ripped from his arms, doesn't know if he'll see his child again. And he takes his own life in a Texas jail.
Yes, so the pattern with these kinds of suicides is that at first they seem inexplicable or due to social causes. But in reality, when we begin to learn more about these individuals, we find that these kinds of social stressors affect vulnerable people particularly. Suicide is a very extreme response to stress. It doesn't occur in well-integrated, healthy people. People are resilient. And so the individuals like Kate Spade, now we know her husband issued a press release that she suffered from depression and anxiety and was seeking treatment, but we also know that she was living alone, separated from her spouse. We know that Anthony Bourdain, from the news reports and the statements of his friends, had a serious problem with substance use disorder when he was younger and had been suffering from depression. We don't know much more than that. And we know nothing about this individual who was treated in this horrible way. Of course people shouldn't be treated like that. That goes without question. It doesn't matter whether you're resilient or vulnerable. But you're going to have a segment of the population is vulnerable. They're already suffering from a depression. We know that life events, bad life events, happen more frequently to people who have a psychiatric illness. If we ignore the psychiatric illness piece, we are colluding with the stigma that has harmed and prevented help coming to people who are suicidal. We have to recognize they often have an illness and they're mostly untreated. That is a terrible state of affairs, and in this country, with all its wealth and resources, shouldn't continue.
Marco Antonio Munoz was the name of the Texas man who took his own life. And of course, we know Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade just in the space of a few days, and yet every day between them, well, between these people altogether, hundreds of people took their own lives. And the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline says calls have spiked since the apparent suicides that became so public last week. Final words, Dr. Mann.
I'm glad calls have spiked. I hope that means that people who need help are reaching out for it. That would be good news.
I want to thank you for being with us, Dr. John Mann, psychiatry professor at Columbia University and a division director at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, past president of the International Academy of Suicide Research and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll be joined by Michael Eric Dyson. He has a new book out, What Truth Sounds Like, RFK James Baldwin, and our unfinished conversation about race in America. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Yeah.
Students from Stoneman Douglas High School performing last night during the Tony Awards, Seasons of Love, from the hit Broadway musical Rent. Their teacher also won an award. One of the teachers at Stoneman Douglas, Melody Hertzfeld, the drama and art teacher who protected so many students as gunmen rampaged through their school on Valentine's Day. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This month marks 50 years since the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. On June 5, 1968, Kennedy was shot dead shortly after winning the California Democratic primary, a major boost in his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. His death came just 2 months after the assassination of the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., and 5 years after the assassination of his own brother, President John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy's record as a political figure is a complicated one. To many Americans, he came to embody the hopes of the civil rights and anti-war movements. But while serving in government, he played a major role in actions these movements fought against. As a young lawyer, Robert Kennedy was a key aide, Republican Senator Joe McCarthy on the notorious Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. As Attorney General under his brother, President John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy signed the wiretap order authorizing the FBI's spying on Martin Luther King, Jr. On foreign policy, Robert Kennedy played a key role in U.S. efforts to overthrow Cuban President Fidel Castro and was part of the inner circle of advisors that backed President Kennedy's escalation of the bombing and destruction of Vietnam. But in his final years, Robert F. Kennedy became a vocal advocate for civil rights. This is Kennedy speaking in Mississippi in 1966.
Created society in which Negroes will be as free as other Americans, free to vote and to learn and to earn their way and to share in the decisions of government, which in turn shapes their lives. We know to accomplish this end will mean great tension and difficulty and strife for all of us, in the North and in the South. But we know that we must make progress, not because it is economically advantageous, not because the law says that we should do so, but because of the fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do.
That was Robert F. Kennedy speaking in Mississippi in 1966. Well, we turn now to a new book by Michael Eric Dyson that looks at Kennedy's evolution on civil rights. It's titled What Truth Sounds Like, RFK, James Baldwin, and Our Unfinished Conversation About Race in America. The book centers on a 1963 meeting Kennedy, then the Attorney General, had with James Baldwin, the famed writer and civil rights activist, as well as other leading figures in the black community, including Lorraine Hansberry, an actor and activist Harry Belafonte, singer and actor Lena Horne, and psychologist Kenneth Clark. This is James Baldwin reflecting on the meeting.
Great shock to me. I want to say this on the air. The Attorney General did not know.
You mean the Attorney General of the United States?
Mr. Robert Kennedy. Didn't know that I would have trouble convincing my nephew to go to Cuba, for example, to liberate the Cubans in defense of a government which now says it is doing everything it can do, which cannot liberate me. Now, there are 20 million people in this country, and you can't put them all in jail. I know how my nephew feels. I know how I feel. I know how the cats in the barbershop feel.
We go now to Washington, D.C. to speak with Michael Eric Dyson, the author of What Truth Sounds Like, RFK, James Baldwin, and Our Unfinished Conversation About Race in America. Michael Eric Dyson is a professor of sociology at Georgetown University, author of many books. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Always great to be here, Amy.
So talk about where you begin the book with the martyrs, and you place it at Dr. King's funeral.
That's right. I begin there talking about the blood of the martyrs soaking the soil of American reality. And then from that soil of brutality, of death, of tragic and traumatic separation from these figures, these icons, who informed our values, our visions, our virtue of American democracy. I wanted to talk about how their deaths, Martin Luther King Jr., John Kennedy's before his, Robert Kennedy's after his, was a kind of traumatic trilogy of transformative deaths that made American values and ideals and struggles for justice that much more plain, that much more tangible, and at the same time, it seems, that much more distant. Because if we were willing to kill these men for various reasons in defense of bigotry and hate and blindness to American inclusion and diversity and justice, then we were further apart from those ideals that seem. But I wanted to start there to suggest that the meeting that I subsequently explore has to be seen in relationship to what they were willing to sacrifice for what they found out. Bobby Kennedy, as you've already indicated, evolved. Once a fearless advocate for Joseph McCarthy, he ends up becoming a serious and considered and principled defender of and advocate for racial justice, but not without consternation, not without contradiction, not without complication. His relationship to Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, is quite interesting because after that death that I began with, after that funeral that I began with, we remember that Bobby Kennedy spoke in Indianapolis bravely about the death of King. He announced to those black people in the hood what had gone on against the advice of his advisors who said, it's going to be tough. You go into the ghetto at this particular moment of the death of their foremost figure. It could be really treacherous for you and very perilous. And he went on anyhow. He gave a brilliant speech quoting the Greek classics and then talked about his brother's death. But later that night, he said privately, this is not the worst thing, that is the death of King, to happen to the American Republic. So he was a very complicated figure.
I wanted to go to that moment in Indianapolis when Robert Kennedy has learned of the death of Dr. King and he breaks the news to supporters as he tells them about King's assassination.
For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. My favorite poet was Aeschylus, and he once wrote, even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
That was Robert Kennedy, the night of King's assassination, breaking the news to his own supporters in Indianapolis. Michael Eric Dyson, you were saying about that night.
And that night, later on, after that remarkable oration, after that appeal to the Greek classics, after that appeal to his own personal suffering, his existential trauma, the remembrance of his brother's death, which lingered above him like an angry cloud of grief, he said that night to aides in a kind of dispassionate and nearly corrosive, and some would say very callous manner, look, this death of King is not the worst thing to happen to the Republic. Of course, remembering his own grief about his brother and knowing that these kind of traumas could be, visited upon the nation from time to time. But he had fights with Martin Luther King Jr., even though after the meeting that I write about, he said, look, you can't talk to Jimmy Baldwin and Belafonte or Lena Horne or especially Jerome Smith, who was a freedom rider, the most decorated freedom rider, perhaps along with John Lewis. They suffered both the most, physically beaten to within an inch of their lives, so to speak. But after that meeting, he said, look, you can't talk to them like you talk to King. And yet when he had the ability to talk to King, there were often verbal exchanges that were sometimes brutal, sometimes honest, and difficult. And yet he ultimately committed to the very principles that motivated Dr. King, and Dr. King accepted that as the price to be paid in order to link arms to fight for justice.
So let's go to that moment of the meeting. Talk about where it took place, who was there, and why you centered your whole book around it.
Right. Well, the meeting took place in New York, on Central Park, at the Kennedy penthouse that belonged to the family, his father, of course. But it was in the family. It's where Martin Luther King Jr. had his first meeting with then candidate for president Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. So it was there that they met. They being Bobby Kennedy and James Baldwin, met the morning before when Baldwin flew out to Hickory Hill after landing in D.C., then got driven out to Hickory Hill by Mr. Kennedy's chauffeur to meet with him in the suburbs of D.C. at his home because he was Attorney General. And they had a pleasant enough meeting, very interested in each other. They expressed their interest in each other. And the plane for Baldwin had been late, so Kennedy said, as they packed up and went off to the city to go to another meeting, he said, look, I'm going to be in New York tomorrow. Why don't you bring some of those people that we talked about that black people listen to? He didn't want to talk to King or Adam Clayton Powell or Whitney Young or any of the established leaders. He wanted to speak to people that, you know, had the ears of the people, so to speak, as the great philosopher Sean Carter would say, streets was talking and who was listening. So the reality is that he said, look, I got some people, Harry Belafonte they listened to, Lena Horne, Lorraine Hansberry, and they happened to be available. He got them together. He said, okay, I'll meet you tomorrow. And they went to the penthouse, and Bobby Kennedy, expecting to be treated with great deference and certainly greeted with gratitude for the enormous contribution that he made, and especially his brother, to civil rights. But it was a checkered record. On the one hand, they were committed in word to the civil rights movement, and some things that Bobby Kennedy did as Attorney General, trying to force J. Edgar Hoover to get a few more black people in the building, talking about voting as a linchpin to arguing for justice. But at the same time, they put on to the federal bench Harold Cox, who called black people the N-word from the bench. They also promised Ernest Vandiver, then the governor of Georgia, that is Mr. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, the president, when he placed a well-timed call to Martin Luther King Jr.'s jailers. Well, he placed the call to the governor because King was in jail in Georgia, and said, let him out. And, you know, it's something that's harsh and unnecessary. And he was let out, and a few days before he was let out, he was let out a few days before the election for the president of the United States of America, and that boosted Kennedy's numbers among black people who could vote. So he promised that governor, however, that I will not use federal legislation to enforce integration and desegregation in your state. So he's playing both ends against the middle. So when Bobby Kennedy shows up there, these very smart black people are aware of that. Jimmy Baldwin has just fired off an electrifying telegram. I know young people don't even know what that is. It's not Twitter, swipe right. It's not Tinder. It's not even rough. It's not social media. It's not even a stencil. He went there, Morse coding or tap, 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 and then communicating a message to the Attorney General that we are outdone by the ghoulish behavior of the buffoonish and yet brutal Bull Connor, those are my words, who is down in Birmingham doing horrible things to black people, unleashing powerful fire hoses, washing them against the wall. The bicuspids and incisors of police dogs are snarling at the flesh of black women, men, and children. And so he said, we've had enough. So he fired that off. Kennedy responded. They have the meeting. And Kennedy, expecting deference, instead got Jerome Smith, who said, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of the pity patter. And you're worried about, because part of the meeting was to figure out why is it that black anger is rising? Why is it that rage is on the rise? Why is it that black people are listening to the black Muslims and not Martin Luther King Jr. or Roy Wilkins or Whitney Young from the Urban League and NAACP, respectively? Why are they being attracted to these voices from beneath? And so Jerome Smith, who was a devotee of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., the philosophy of nonviolence, said, don't worry about the black Muslims. They ain't voting. They're not going to get out here and do anything that's going to bother you ultimately, politically. But what you got to worry about is a guy like me, who's a devotee of these principles, and I'm ready to take up a gun. I'm ready to go into the streets because I'm tired of the injustice that we are enduring. That was astonishing to Mr. Kennedy. It electrified the room.